It is 7 o'clock, which means you're watching The Only Breakfast Show, live from Westminster. NHS England says there will be a significant reduction in vaccine supplies next month. Yet, both Pfizer and AstraZeneca insist that they're on course to meet their domestic UK delivery commitments. So, what is the issue? And could it affect the PM's roadmap out of lockdown? We'll be asking the Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, about that and his new plans to get more rough sleepers off our streets in a few moments' time. But also coming up this morning, helping NHS staff to communicate whilst cocooned in PPE. We'll be chatting to the security expert and the surgeon about the new hands-free systems, allowing hospital workers to talk to each other on the front line. Also on the programme, at the top of her game, we'll be chatting to the football coaching grandmother who's netted herself a national awards and high praise from none other than the England manager himself. That's coming your way at 10 tonight on this Thursday, the 18th of March. A row over the rollout. Pfizer and AstraZeneca reject NHS claims that the UK is facing a COVID vaccine shortage, saying there is no threat to domestic supplies. It comes as the European Medicines Agency prepares to make a decision about the safety of the AstraZeneca jab amidst concerns about blood clots. Potential breach of human rights. Concerns that more than 500 do not resuscitate decisions were made during the pandemic without consent. Immigration overhaul reports that the Home Secretary wants to send asylum seekers to processing centres in other countries. Building blocks to house the homeless. An extra £212 million to tackle rough sleeping. Critics say it is not enough.
It won't provide the long-term, permanent support we need for people to end homelessness.
A bit disappointing for some today across the east, with some rain coming in across eastern and southeast England where it'll feel cool. But for others, there will be some warm sunshine developing. More details on that coming up before 1:30.
Morning all. Pfizer and AstraZeneca, well, they've both denied claims by NHS England that there will be a significant reduction in COVID vaccine supplies to the UK next month, with both drugs giants insisting that they remain on course to meet their domestic delivery commitments. Concerns have been raised that a slowdown in the vaccine rollout could have an impact on the Prime Minister's roadmap out of lockdown. Well, let's take a look at the main developments over the vaccine rollout this morning. Starting with this, well, last night, NHS England sent out a letter to vaccination centres across the country, warning that supplies would be significantly constrained in April. Now, issuing new guidance, it said that under 50s should not be offered a first jab except in exceptional circumstances. Well, the UK's two main drugs manufacturers, Pfizer and AstraZeneca, have both, in their own way, rejected the claim, insisting that there is no threat to the domestic supply chain. They say they remain on course to meet their delivery commitments and denied that they are facing disruption. Still, the EU has threatened to block vaccine exports to the UK and other countries with higher vaccine rollout. All this as the European Medicines Agency will announce its verdict on the safety of the AstraZeneca jab later today. Well, let's bring in our political correspondent, Rob Powell, joining us on the show. Look, there are plenty of questions to be putting to the Housing Secretary, of course, on his brief, but on COVID. But at its core, do we really understand what on earth is going on with this vaccine supply at the moment?
So there's still not a terribly large amount of clarity on it. In part, that's because the government haven't laid out or been terribly transparent about how many vaccine supplies are coming in, when and where from. But I think it's important to read the statement that AstraZeneca put out last night quite carefully. They talk about no problems, but they importantly talk about no problems to their domestic UK supply chain. Now, that matters because AstraZeneca manufactures, or at least has licensing agreements to manufacture the jab abroad as well, such as in India. And it is those global supplies of jabs that are thought to be the reason behind this significant reduction. I think one of the big questions for government this morning is, in terms of its timetable out of lockdown, is that hooked to the public targets for vaccine rollout? So end of July for everyone, mid-April for over 50s? Because if it is, government and ministers last night were saying that actually we're still on target to meet that. But around Westminster, the whispers have been that if you look at the current pace of rollout, the government is going faster than those expected target dates. So has that map out of lockdown been hooked to the public targets, or has it been hooked to the potentially accelerated private targets that have been talked about in Westminster?
Well, let's hope we get a little bit of clarity in that in the not-too-distant future. For now, Rob, thanks very much indeed. But as we always do, let's take a quick look at the latest data in terms of the UK's battle against coronavirus. A further 5,758 new cases were recorded in the latest 24-hour period. In addition, 141 more deaths. Now, that takes the total number of people who've died with COVID-19 to 125,831. The figures also show that 25.27 million first doses of a vaccine have now been given. And as we've been saying, the Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, joins us now once again on the programme. Mr Jenrick, always good to see you, particularly at this early hour. We've got a lot to talk about on your brief, but can we just start with the issues, such as they may be around vaccination? Why has there been an instruction, a change to the schedule in terms of vaccination? How much of a delay do we see being built into the system?
Well, we do think there are going to be some supply issues in the weeks ahead, but this isn't anything that people should be worried about. We're still on course to meet our targets. That's to vaccinate all of the groups 1 to 9 by the middle of April and all adults to receive their first vaccine by the end of July. Nobody who has an appointment should be concerned. You're still going to get your second vaccine. All those appointments will be honoured. But we always said right from the beginning that a new manufacturing process would have its lumps and bumps, and that has been the case in the past, and I'm sure it will be in the future. We're sourcing vaccines from all over the world, and we are experiencing occasionally some issues, and that's led to this issue with some supply in the coming weeks. But as I say, the main thing is we're still very much on course. We've still got line of sight to deliver the vaccines and to meet our targets.
Just to be really specific, and indeed on something you just mentioned there, problems in obtaining the vaccine from around the world. There's a suggestion this morning that perhaps the issue as regards the AZ Oxford vaccine is a problem in India, where they do produce. Is that your understanding?
Well, I'm not going to get into the specific contracts that we have with different manufacturers. We're sourcing vaccines from many countries all over the world. It's a very complex international supply chain. And as I say, that does mean occasionally we will experience issues. And that is what we've experienced right now. But there is no reason to be concerned. We are on course to meet our target, which is to get those first categories of 1 to 9 vaccinated by the middle of April. And that was always a challenging target. Remember, we only met our target in mid-February with a couple of days' grace. And so the targets the Prime Minister has set us are not easy ones, but we are on course to achieve that one. And myself, Matt Hancock, Nadeem Zahawi, the government, we have line of sight that we've got enough vaccines to do that. And so that's the main thing, and that's what we're focused on right now.
Indeed, and of course, as you allude to, the Health Secretary yesterday in Downing Street made it very clear that those deadlines, those targets would still be met. There is a little bit of concern, though, on whether or not this might have some impact on the roadmap itself. I mean, is the roadmap actually based on those kind of confirmed vaccination targets, on those dates that the Health Secretary still stuck to yesterday?
Well, the vaccine rollout is our route out of this. The more people we vaccinate, the easier it will be to open up our society and get us back to the way of life that we all want to see. There's no reason to believe that the roadmap is affected by this temporary shortage in supply. The main thing is that we are on course to meet the targets that the Prime Minister set us of getting the categories 1 to 9, which is all the over 50s, including the clinically extremely vulnerable below that age, vaccinated by the middle of April. So there's no concern that we're off course with the roadmap.
Sure. Just one last question on the vaccine, and it is a distance from your brief, so you may well not know this. But does the Moderna jab start coming into circulation in April?
I don't know, to be honest, the exact date that the Moderna jab will be in use within the UK. Obviously, we have the orders placed, and we'll be using them as quickly as they come into the country.
Actually, apologies, Secretary of State. I inadvertently misspoke there. One more question on the vaccines. What do you make of the sabre rattling that we're seeing from, amongst others, Ursula von der Leyen, the threat that somehow the EU could have a rather spurious interpretation, to my eyes at least, of Article 22 and intervene in vaccinations, in delivery of vaccines that we have bought, that we have paid for, that are on a contractual basis ours, that the EU might step in to intervene there?
Well, I was surprised and disappointed by those comments, but the Prime Minister had spoken earlier in the year to Ursula von der Leyen, and she gave a very clear commitment, which was that the EU would not engage in this sort of activity, that contractual responsibilities would be honoured, and that's exactly what we intend to do. And I hope and expect the EU to stick to their side of the bargain as well. It isn't at all helpful if we enter into this sort of conversation. That's not the way the UK is behaving or wants to behave in the future. We all need to work together to get through this. Supplies of vaccines rely on very complex international manufacturing supply chains, as we've just said, and so everybody needs to have free trade of vaccines and not get into this sort of difficulty.
Talk to us a little bit then about rough sleeping. The rough sleeping accommodation programme, of course, did serve to take thousands of people off of the streets at a time when, everyone was very, very concerned about the spread of the pandemic. We certainly knew a lot less, and we're moving on to kind of the second stage of that now.
That's right. A year ago, almost to the day, we launched Everyone In, which had a simple objective of asking those people who are sleeping rough on the streets and most vulnerable to COVID-19 to come into safe and secure accommodation. It was hugely successful. We ended up bringing in over 37,000 people who are either sleeping on the streets or in otherwise pretty precarious situations like sofa surfing with friends and relatives. Most of those people have now been able to move on into better accommodation, either social housing, the private rental sector, or what's called move-on accommodation, which is temporary accommodation with wraparound care. About 27,000 people have been given that sort of help over the course of the last year. But we've still got many people in temporary emergency accommodation. And today we're putting in place further support so that we can build up good quality accommodation to help those people to access it and begin to rebuild their lives. We've secured over £400 million, and today we're releasing the next 200 million of that so that charities and local councils across the country can invest in up to 6,000 new move-on units over the course of this Parliament. And that will give us a new national asset of accommodation, so that if people are sleeping rough, they can be moved on, given a home, and then begin to rebuild their lives, get help for substance abuse.
There will be no one who is working. Sorry, apologies, Minister. We've got a finite amount of time. There will be no one working in this sector that will not welcome additional money. Of course, they will welcome additional money. The question is whether or not it goes quite far enough. I mean, the statistics, as you were mentioning there, 37,500 people, in essence, helped in as a result of Everyone In. But that figure, there is obviously going to be a disparity, but that figure of 37,500 is a country mile away from your department's own estimates of how many rough sleepers there were in the country. It was roughly 4,300 in March 2020. I mean, you've been on a bit of a learning curve here, but are we still on course to eradicate homelessness by 2024?
Yes, I think we are. By that, we mean that nobody should have to sleep rough on the streets. I think we've learned from everyone and that there will always be some people who do, for a variety of complex reasons. Even at the height of the lockdown last spring, when we asked everybody in the country who was sleeping rough on the streets to come in, we still found a small number of people who chose not to. But our objective is that there is good care, that everybody is offered accommodation within at least a night or so of being seen on the streets. And that is what we're working towards. We made huge progress. Last year, the number of people sleeping rough on the streets fell by about 37%, according to the statistics that were published a month ago. That's a major step forward, but there will be big challenges ahead. And the strategy that we are putting in place is not just one of housing, but it is also one of health, making sure there is proper support for people for their mental health and for substance abuse, which is a really significant factor in why people end up on the streets and then the issues that they face when they're on the streets.
OK, Minister, just before we wrap up, there's a policy initiative, I think, from Priti Patel that will raise a few eyebrows doing the rounds this morning. A few reports that asylum seekers could be sent from the United Kingdom. Asylum seekers who have arrived in the United Kingdom could be sent to third countries to have their asylum application processed. What is the thinking behind this? And in what way will this deter people from making the journey to the UK in the first place?
Well, this isn't an announcement by the Home Secretary. This is speculation on work that she is doing and will be saying more on in the weeks ahead. So I can't give you all the answers this morning, but it is extremely important that we have a robust immigration system and that those people coming to the country to seek asylum can do so in safety. We don't want anyone's lives to be put at risk. We don't want people to be at the hands of people traffickers. We've seen people, including young children, dying making perilous crossings across the Channel. That isn't something that we want to see. And so if there are safer and better ways of doing that, then we should be exploring them. And that's exactly what the Home Secretary is doing.
Mr. Jenrick, good to see you this morning. Thanks for being with us. Lots more still to come on the show this morning. In about 15 minutes' time, we're going to be speaking on the issue of homelessness to the founder of The Big Issue, John Bird. That £212 million funding announcement that Mr. Jenrick was just describing. Immediately after that, we'll be speaking to Labour's Rachel Reeves, asking why the party is backing calls for an immediate public inquiry into the handling of the pandemic. At 8:20, as restrictions begin to ease, we'll be speaking to the head of Hayes Travel about the demand for booking holidays abroad and the pressure on the travel industry. Let's take a look at a few of the other stories making the news this morning. And a new report claims that delaying the winter lockdown caused up to 27,000 extra deaths in England. The Resolution Foundation think tank highlights the huge mistake which should be central to any public inquiry into the UK's handling of COVID-19. The report also highlights two key successes in the pandemic response: the vaccine rollout and support to protect businesses and employees. Thousands of leukemia patients will be offered a new cancer treatment after health officials said it was suitable to be used on the NHS. Those in England with incurable blood cancer will be able to take the pills, which act as an alternative to chemotherapy. The Scottish Government says the nation's railways will be nationalised by the end of March next year. The ScotRail franchise, currently run by Abellio, will be taken over by the government as an operator of last resort when the Dutch company's contract runs out in 2022. The Scottish Transport Secretary has said ScotRail staff will keep their jobs under the new plans, which have been welcomed by unions. The fashion industry will have to contribute to the cost of recycling clothes by the end of next year. Under new government proposals to cut textile waste, the industry is estimated to account for 4% of yearly global carbon emissions, and over 900,000 tonnes of textiles are thrown out by households every year. The EU's medicine regulator will release details of its review into the safety of the Oxford AZ vaccine later today. Several countries, including Germany, France and Italy, have halted rollouts as a precaution over safety concerns linked to blood clots. All this as the European Commission President warned that she may block vaccine exports to countries mass manufacturing their own vaccine. Our Europe correspondent Adam Parsons reports.
Today, Europe's medicines regulator will announce its verdict on the safety of the AstraZeneca vaccine. Its use has been suspended in most EU countries to investigate a possible link to a rare form of blood clot. The vaccine is expected to be cleared again for public use, but the controversy over the people behind this British product may not be over. The President of the European Commission, caustic in her criticism, saying AstraZeneca had persistently failed to deliver the number of doses that Europe had ordered and paid for, and she raised the spectre that the EU could respond by stopping the export of vaccines to the UK.
If the situation does not change, we will have to reflect on how to make exports to vaccine-producing countries dependent on their level of openness. So we are exporting a lot to countries that are themselves producing vaccines. And we think this is an invitation to be open, so that we also see exports from those countries coming back to the European Union.
The government's response to that threat, an air of shock that commitments to open supply chains were being threatened.
We expect those assurances and legal contracted supply to be respected. Frankly, I'm surprised we're having this conversation. It is normally what the UK and the EU team up with to object when other countries with less democratic regimes than our own engage in that kind of brinkmanship.
This is a row that now engulfs politics, public health and public sentiment. That is a very combustible mix, especially when European leaders are under pressure for leading a sluggish vaccine rollout.
Europe's problems in dealing with this COVID crisis are obvious, and they may be about to get worse. In many countries, the rate of infections has now gone up steeply in Germany, Italy and France, and that probably means more restrictions.
This is a city and a continent hobbled by nervousness and uncertainty. The line where politics stops and the business of vaccines starts is becoming very hard to define. Adam Parsons, Sky News, Paris.
The Care Quality Commission has warned that individuals' human rights may have been breached during the pandemic after it found more than 500 cases where do not resuscitate decisions were made that had not been discussed with the patients or their families. The Commission found that some were unaware that a decision had been made about their loved one's treatment and has called for government ministers to get involved in tackling the issue. Sky's Ali Fortescue has been taking a closer look at the story from the newsroom. Morning, Ali. I mean, this is quite something, isn't it? 500 cases where the individual or the people that were in a guardian position were not even talked to about a DNR order.
It is quite something. I mean, we are potentially talking about hundreds of human rights breaches. As you say, it was something that there was concern about already, which is why the Care Quality Commission were asked to do this rapid review about how these DNAR, do not attempt resuscitation decisions, were being made. And as you say, they think that in more than 500 cases, the family and the patient themselves might not have actually been told that the DNAR decision was made, which potentially means that they would not have been resuscitated, would not have had a life-saving resuscitation. It's worth saying that in most cases, these sorts of resuscitations do not actually mean that the patient survives, but it can be life-saving. The CQC were concerned that a blanket approach had been taken with particular groups, for example, people with learning difficulties. They say that in part this was down to the unprecedented pressure from the pandemic, bad record keeping, but there were underlying issues too. Charities, unsurprisingly, have been voicing their concern. Age UK saying this calls for a complete overhaul of the system. And we've been speaking to another charity, Compassion in Dying, who interestingly say that this has really brought a spotlight onto end-of-life care, and more clarity is needed either way for families about how these decisions should be made.
Do not attempt resuscitation decisions are an important part of good end-of-life care. And at Compassion in Dying, we've found repeatedly that they give people peace of mind. So during the pandemic, calls to our information line doubled, and hundreds of people actually contacted us wanting help to refuse potentially harmful CPR through a do not resuscitate form. And I think at a time of great anxiety and uncertainty, people actually wanted practical support to know what they needed to do to retain some sense of control and some sense of peace of mind.
Now, NHS England say that the NHS has repeatedly instructed local clinicians and services that the blanket DNA CPR decisions would be unacceptable, and that access to treatment and care for people should be and is made on an individual basis in consultation with family and carers. And the Care Quality Commission have said that they want ministers to work with the care sector and to oversee a group to make sure that this can't happen again.
Ali, thank you. A couple of other stories making the headlines this morning. Tens of thousands more people should be prescribed nature walks, group gardening and art classes on the NHS in a bid to improve physical and mental health. That's according to a report from the Royal Colleges of Psychiatrists and Occupational Therapists, which say many are missing out on social prescribing, even though it could help combat the mental health fallout from the pandemic. Letting toddlers play frequently on tablets, phones and game consoles could be putting them at higher risk of emotional and behavioural problems when they start school. That's according to new research from the Finnish Institute of Health and Welfare, which found the increased screen time has multiple risks for children. Google has removed more than 3 billion adverts for violating its policies in 2020. Including just under 100 million related to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, the company has revealed. The annual Ads Safety Report shows it suspended over 1.7 million advertiser accounts for breaking the company's rules. The Welsh goat population has rocketed after a contraception drive was cancelled due to the pandemic. You might remember these pictures from last year, when the goats of Great Orme Headland roamed the deserted streets of nearby London in lockdown. Well, during the latest lockdown, the goats have ventured even further after numbers rose. Stop it. Sparking concerns that as restrictions ease, the animals who are used to having the streets to themselves might actually be in some danger as the traffic begins to rebuild. And we'll have much more on that story as and when we get it. Time to check in and see how the weather is looking this morning. Isobel standing by. And Isobel, am I wrong? It felt just a little bit cooler this morning as I forced myself out of bed.
Basically, you just want to talk about the goats. I don't think you're very interested in the weather at all. Yeah, it will feel a little bit cooler, Neil. Next couple of days, particularly across the southeast, fresher, and there'll be a frost on Friday night. But before that comes, let's take a look at some of the warmth we've got in store today.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
So the cooler air that will be coming in through tomorrow and the next couple of days will be to the east of this frontal system here. So this frontal system comes in across eastern England, gives some pretty dire weather for eastern England and the southeast today. As that clears westwards overnight tonight, there'll be some sunnier weather tomorrow, but it will feel a little chilly. Now today, though, the big story really is that across the north, when sunshine becomes rather more widespread after a bit of a cloudy start, particularly northern England, Scotland, you'll find that temperatures shoot up to 16 to potentially 18 Celsius there. A beautiful afternoon for some across central and northern Britain. Really nice in that sunshine, but actually quite disappointing where you hold on to cloud, and obviously disappointing where you have that rain in eastern England. But as I hinted at, that will move inland and peter out tomorrow. Sunshine following.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Izzy, thank you. Still to come on Breakfast this morning. A funding boost for new homes and support for rough sleepers, but does it go far enough? We'll be speaking to the founder of The Big Issue. That's coming your way next.
Journalism is under attack.
He's clearly marked as press.
A riot has actually been declared.
You have to have the facts.
I will stand in the way of the enemy.
You have to have the evidence on camera, because people are doubting everything.
You are further pushing the agenda that is condemning all of us.
To prove a wrong.
To expose corruption. To show the truth.
They just want to celebrate.
I don't think any journalist wants anything more than that.
We've all missed so much in our lives over the last 12 months, but maybe holidays are towards the top of that list. The excitement of planning, booking, and then travelling is something that we all look forward to in our year. So we're delighted that on Monday of next week, we'll be putting on sale holidays sailing in the UK coastal waters of the UK on our flagship Britannia and our newest ship Iona. So giving people the opportunity to break the norm and get away and have that ultimate staycation on our ships with all the incredible food and entertainment that's to offer. Well, one of the things I think we can feel very proud of as a nation is our vaccination programme. And current estimates show that a huge number of people will be vaccinated by this summer. And our first sailing is, in actual fact, on the 27th of June. So we're anticipating a very large audience being able to book onto our holidays. But as you're right, we are asking our guests to prove that they are vaccinated, they've had their second dose, and then we will welcome them on board to give them an incredible holiday.
I'm Tom Cheshire and I'm Sky's Asia correspondent based here in Beijing.
This police officer was shot through the calf.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
Welcome back. The Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, has told the programme this morning that the government is expecting a vaccine rollout slowdown next month, caused by, in his words, global supply issues. But Mr Jenrick said this shouldn't have an impact on the roadmap out of lockdown.
We're sourcing vaccines from many countries all over the world. It's a very complex international supply chain. And as I say, that does mean occasionally we will experience issues. And that is what we've experienced right now. There's no reason to believe that the roadmap is affected by this temporary shortage in supply. The main thing is that we are on course to meet the targets that the Prime Minister set us of getting the categories 1 to 9, which is all the over 50s, including the clinically extremely vulnerable below that age vaccinated by the middle of April. So there's no concern that we're off course with the roadmap.
The Housing Secretary also announced £212 million in funding to build new homes and support rough sleepers. Follows a report that revealed the true scale of the problem, 9 times worse than the official government estimate. Well, let's speak now to John Bird, of course, the founder of The Big Issue, who's joined us now on the programme from Cambridge. John, great to see you this morning. And of course, plenty for us to talk about in terms of the latest we've been hearing from Robert Jenrick. But from your perspective, to what extent did that Everyone In initiative actually work in getting some of the most vulnerable people in society, clearly, those that are sleeping rough, off the streets and somewhere warm during the pandemic?
It worked remarkably well, considering that the government, no government, had ever since the Victorian period taken any responsibility for people on the streets. They'd looked upon them as a necessary decoration of our society and our democracy. So the government, for the first time, coordinated loads of organisations to come together to help to remove as many people from the streets. They didn't manage to get everybody. There was probably 2,000 or 3,000 they didn't get. But it was a magnificent achievement, very much like the pandemic, the inoculation program, very showing that we can do incredible things if we put our minds to it and we get the government to do it. Now, obviously, we've got to go further forward. Can I ask a very simple question of you? Aren't you surprised at how expensive it is to run homelessness? He's given us a couple of $100 million rough sleeping. He's given us a couple of $100 million a few months ago. Now he's going to give us another couple of $100 million. Isn't it ridiculous, the amount of money we spend on rough sleepers, because we never face up to the fact that these people are a public health problem, a public health need. It's a violation of human rights to actually be on the streets. And all we're doing, in a sense, is responding to the effects and never dealing with the cause.
Well, John, perhaps you can explain just a little bit more about where all that money then gets spent. I mean, the thing that surprises me is, of course, when you look at the figures of the people that were covered by the scheme. Let's say, just for the sake of rounding up, 37,500. You also look at the Housing Department's estimates of how many rough sleepers there are, and that was in the low single-digit thousands. Now, of course, you know, the figure of the 37,500 would have included lots of people who were sofa surfing, who weren't able to stay at friends' houses. But there's a big old gap, isn't there?
Well, the enormous gap is that, I mean, you can't always blame the government for figures which have been carried on the way that figures are measured, because a lot of the measuring is done locally by local councillors and organisations. The real problem to me is that this government came in 2019 and has immediately run into the fact that we are still treating homeless people on the streets as almost a fixed asset. And my big problem is, when are we going to get this government, or any government, to say, OK, when are we going to end this enormous catastrophe that has hit our streets? And as you say, your figures really do prove that it's not a minor consideration, it is a major consideration. When I was a lad, when I was a rough sleeper, there was hardly anybody around because the police stopped you from doing it. Now we have the police have turned their back, the local authorities never have enough money to help people on the streets. So what happens is that through austerity, people have ended up on the streets. I want to know, when is the strategy to end homelessness on the streets? When is the strategy? That is much more important than any temporary measure. Is this temporary measure going to turn into permanent homes and wraparound support systems for people who have the demons that drive them onto the street addressed?
I mean, the government has put a date on it, of course, I believe 2024 for an end to rough sleeping. But later this year, John, I think I'm right in saying, you know, the big issue will have been around for 30 years, for 3 decades. And you've been banging this drum for a long, long time, and successive governments have either been unable or unwilling to deal with the problem. I mean, do you honestly believe, in your heart of hearts, that we can end rough sleeping in the UK?
I don't know whether you can end it, because there's always people percolating, dropping down. Sure. But you can stop it. You can say, we are not going to accept the violation of human rights that rough sleeping is, the fact that you're going to die before anybody else, you're going to have mental health problems, you're going to have physical health problems. I think you can stop it, but the way to stop it is to create the communities that are much cheaper than spending billions, as has happened over the time that we've been running the big issue, billions that have spent on responding to rough sleeping, on accommodating rough sleeping, rather than building the therapeutic communities which would enable us to take the demons out of people who are caught in the trap of homelessness. I'd say, you know, what we did 30 years ago was we wanted to help homeless people off the streets, and we realised that the best thing to do that was to give them something to do, a way of making their own money so they weren't getting into grief. I do believe that this government, the first government I've ever known, whether you agree with them, their political complexion or not, has raised the issue for all of us. We can do something about it.
Good to see you this morning, John. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, almost a year ago, if you can imagine it, the UK entered its first coronavirus lockdown, with our lives changing forever. The questions, though, over how Britain has handled this pandemic have been raised for months, but now bereaved families and indeed politicians are urging the government to join them in calls for a public inquiry. Labour's Rachel Reeves joins us once again on the programme. Ms Reeves, always good to see you. Do hope you're well. Just give us a little bit of detail about the public inquiry, the scope that you would have it, and when you would see it start.
Well, I think that families have got to be front and centre of this, those people who have lost loved ones. And I recently met with some of those families, and that meeting will stay with me, and those stories will stay with me for the rest of my life. And what I'm hearing from bereaved families is that they need to understand better what's happened, and they are desperate, really, for lessons to be learned from what happened, because I don't think any of us think that this virus has gone away, that there won't be other viruses and diseases in the future, and that we must learn from what we've gone through in the last year so that something can be salvaged from all of this. And families now, as you say, Neil, a year on, want this public inquiry to begin. I think that we all know there must be some inquiry at some stage, but let's get on with it so that we can learn lessons this summer. Now, the roadmap is supposed to be completed on the 21st of June. That seems to me to be the perfect opportunity to get this inquiry up and running so that we can rapidly learn lessons and then get that justice and that closure and those answers for those people whose lives have been most profoundly affected by this.
We did, though, hear from Jonathan Van Tam yesterday on the issue of a public inquiry, and he suggested that it would be a distraction.
Look, I think it is up in the end to the government to decide when an inquiry will happen, but it's got to be a question of when and not if. Now, I think there should have been a rapid review last summer to better prepare us for what we then faced in the autumn and winter. And I think if that had have happened, we could have saved lives in the autumn and winter. And I think we must learn that lesson as well, and now use this opportunity of the summer and the end of the roadmap to get this inquiry up and running. Now, of course, it's going to mean that people are going to have to give evidence and that we need a greater understanding of it. But I think it is essential, and I think it can help all of us. It can help the government, it can help the NHS, because whether it is issues around PPE, test and trace, the situation in our care homes, all of those need to be better understood so that we can better learn lessons for the future.
But just in terms of the period that you just mentioned, kind of November, December, the beginning of this year, are you saying that the inability of the government to learn lessons from what went before that led to people losing their lives over Christmas and New Year?
Last summer, the government focused on eat out to help out. I think the focus last summer should have been preparing our NHS and our systems for what the autumn and winter was likely to throw at us. I think that was a missed opportunity. And the government didn't learn the lessons. We were too slow to lock down a year ago. We were too slow in the autumn, and we were too slow at Christmas. If there had been that review last summer, perhaps some of those mistakes that had been made in March might not have been made in the autumn and winter. And perhaps
by mistakes, you mean decisions taken by the government which led to people either suffering serious illness or perhaps even losing their lives?
The government were told by SAGE to have a circuit break in the autumn. It took weeks for that circuit break to be put into place. People were urging the government in the run-up to Christmas to lock down. The 5 days of mixing was going to be disastrous in terms of numbers of lives lost. The government were too slow to take those decisions. And that's why I'm saying that a public inquiry is essential. It's essential for those people who have lost loved ones to understand what happened and the decisions made. But it's also essential to learn lessons to save lives in the future. And that's why we're saying that now is the time for that public inquiry, so we can better understand, but most crucially, learn the lessons so that never again do we experience what we've experienced in the last year with the 120 lives already.
What did you make of the evidence that Dominic Cummings gave to the Science and Technology Committee yesterday, particularly as regards the ability or the inability of the Department of Health to manage the COVID-19 crisis in its early stages?
Well, look, there were obviously massive problems, and he highlighted the ones around PPE. We saw frontline workers who were not properly protected in our NHS, in our care system, in our transport system as well. And I heard from a woman who lost her father, who drove a bus to and from Ealing Hospital every day and ended up dying in that hospital because he wasn't properly protected. So, look, we know there are problems there. I would say to Dominic Cummings, though, you played a role as well, and you undermined public trust in the system when you travelled to County Durham and Barnard Castle. And so he's got to take some of the responsibility as well for what happened last year. But I think that increasingly voices from all sides in the political spectrum, but most importantly, the voices of the bereaved families have got to be heard when they say that there must be a public inquiry. And that's why I'm putting my support behind that as well, because as I said at the beginning, Neil, the stories that I heard from bereaved families, they will stay with me forever. And I think we've got to be led by those people who have suffered most in the last year and hear their pleas and their demands for that public inquiry that they need and we need as a country.
Ms Reeves, I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Don't think I didn't see that copy of your book just over your left shoulder there as well. Rachel Reeves, thanks very much for joining us on the programme. Still to come on the programme, well, as the pandemic restrictions continue to ease into the summer, we'll speak to a scientist about a new study that looks at what impact, if any, different climates have on COVID.
I'm Alex Crawford and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
Breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us.
India's fatality rate is less than 2%, one of the lowest in the world. The concern here is that the public healthcare system is inadequate.
It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory.
These students are defying the prohibitory orders, and now they're going to be arrested. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. What is feared that over 200 people might have died because of these landslides. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. This is one of the most sensitive areas of northeast Delhi where there's been clashes. I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
For the early risers.
As we examine the story beyond the headline.
For the knowledge seekers.
Welcome to Divided States.
For the straight talkers. The curious and the ones who want to be entertained.
Backstage, Sky News' entertainment podcast.
For wherever you are.
Welcome to Sophie Ridge on Sunday podcast.
For the ones who want to know more.
Welcome to the All Out Politics podcast.
For the listeners.
From Sky News Storycast.
Sky News Podcasts. Listen and subscribe for free.
Did you know that if we make small changes to our lives, we can reduce air pollution by loads? But how much? Exactly, loads.
Rain again for eastern parts of the country. That'll gradually spill in from the east across East Anglia and the southeast as the day goes on, making it feel quite cool there. Other areas seeing variable amounts of cloud, but some sunshine too. I should think central and southern Scotland, northwest England, parts of West Wales seeing some of the best of the weather today, and here warm as well. A few spots getting up to around 16 to potentially 18 Celsius in Scotland. Now, for most places, there are low levels of air pollution, but in towns and near busy roads, it could be moderate in a few spots.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
A World Meteorological Organization task team is warning against using weather conditions to determine whether to ease coronavirus restrictions after issuing its first report looking at weather and air quality having an impact on COVID-19. task team member and Met Office scientist Rosa Barciela joins us now on the programme. Rosa, great to have you on. Just explain, if you can, the link, if there is indeed any link, between climate conditions and COVID transmission.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. Yes, so as you said, the World Meteorological Organization convened a team of international and interdisciplinary experts last summer to provide a rapid review of those meteorological and air quality factors that potentially could be affecting the COVID-19 pandemic. And what our report found was that the transmission dynamics appear to have been controlled primarily by government interventions rather than by those meteorological and air quality factors. And when I say meteorological, I mean things like temperature, humidity, or solar radiation, for example.
Well, just on that topic then, because we have heard, not just from the British government, but from other governments, a very obvious link being made between the winter time and COVID-19 transmission and perhaps increased risk. Is that then, on the basis of what you see, and you're speaking from a meteorological standpoint, of course, but on the basis of what you see, is that then less to do with the environmental conditions and rather more to do with common cold, so on?
So yes, it's a good question, and if I could add a little bit of context to say that we have to take into account that this is a new virus, a new disease. It didn't exist 15 months ago, and so what we know now, given that is only limited research that is being produced, and only 1 year really is passed, is that at this stage, really, the evidence does not support the use of meteorological factors as the basis for government to relax their interventions, because those meteorological conditions cannot be unequivocally attributable to reduced rates of transmission. And there is some laboratory, very controlled studies that seem to suggest that the virus survives longer in cold, dry, and low ultraviolet or solar radiation conditions. However, these studies have not yet indicated if direct meteorological influences on the virus have meaningful influence on the transmission rate and the real-world conditions.
Just in terms of your report, of course, you've been looking at you've been examining the circumstances, when people are outside, and if you're talking about seasonality, that makes sense. But I wonder if there is anything in your report that might lend some weight to, or might suggest strategies in terms of ventilation, in terms of air filters, in terms of increasing airflow through places like, well, the studio that I'm speaking to you from at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so that was completely out of scope in this report, and we didn't look at any kind of interventions, or indeed we didn't look at any kind of indoor, for example, air quality. We just focused on outdoor air quality and the meteorological conditions that I mentioned earlier. So unfortunately, yes, I'm not qualified to talk about that.
Rosa, not a problem, but on that basis then, so where does the task team take its efforts next?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there was a lot of discussion, or there has been a lot of discussion about seasonality and the underlying mechanisms, direct or indirect, and whether or not this potentially could become seasonal over time. So we are thinking about exactly, what are the topics perhaps that could be more useful to national Met services in terms of addressing those potential, opportunities if this virus were to become a transition information were to become seasonal over time, then there might be a case for using meteorological and air quality information to support monitoring or forecasting of these virus. But I would like to add as well that what we'd like to see is this report being yet another tool and piece of information that decision makers and the government will use in a combination with the many other information and studies that are out there.
Rosa Barthiela, great to talk to you this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Some interesting contrasts in the weather today. Eastern parts of the country rather cool and grey and damp actually as some rain comes in from the North Sea, but there'll be others that see some good chunks of sunshine developing after a rather cloudy start. In fact, I should think across northern England and Scotland through this afternoon, temperatures could well reach 16 to potentially 18 Celsius. It just becomes beautiful in some of these northern areas through today. Maybe northern coast cool and grey, but inland lots of sunshine and really feeling very pleasant indeed compared to that damp and dreary and breezy east coast there. That rain comes inland and weakens actually overnight tonight, but it could get stuck across some central areas tomorrow, giving a cool grey day. Either side of that bank of cloud, though, some sunshine and plenty of blue sky for tomorrow afternoon across southeast Britain.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Isobel, thank you. Coming up in the next hour on Sky News Breakfast, the Housing Secretary told us there will be a slowdown in the UK's vaccine rollout because of global supply issues. We'll have more next.